A battle lost or won is easily described, understood, and appreciated. But the moral growth of a great nation requires reflection, as well as observation, to appreciate it. The life of a nation is secure only while the nation is honest, truthful, and virtuous. We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and the future. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Man's greatness consists in his ability to do and the proper application of his powers to things needed to be done. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. It is not light that we need, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The limit of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. I prayed for 20 years, but received no answer until I prayed with my legs. The soul that is within me no man can degrade. The thing worse than rebellion is the thing that causes rebellion. So, those are all quotes from the great Frederick Douglass, who is the topic of our podcast today. And, I chose to do this because, it's difficult. It's very difficult. I've been kind of wrestling with this podcast for a while. How do I present it? How do I, tell this story? It's essentially a book report. How do I talk about something so incredibly uncomfortable? And I thought about it for quite a while, and I wasn't even sure if it was right for me to talk about, if I was the right person to bring this up. But I think that sometimes with things that make you uncomfortable, especially when they're history, you need to look at them and observe them and understand them and figure out, what lessons can be learned and never shirk away, especially from a first-hand history like this from Frederick Douglass. And our book report will be based on My Bondage, My Freedom. And, in today's world where we're seeing things happening like books being banned, and we're seeing governors going crazy trying to stamp out history and anything that makes people uncomfortable, and that's what they're going with. Well, today we're going to do some uncomfortable, because history often is uncomfortable. But one of the people who needs, more attention and more study, and one of the most interesting characters, one of the most, heroic stories, and with good humor, is My Bondage, My Freedom. So, here we go. This is History and Whatevea with James Manning III. And we're going to talk about Frederick Douglass. Did you know that you're on a podcast? Yes, you're on a podcast. History and Whatevea. This is very uncomfortable. And I've read this book by Frederick Douglass, who was originally born in somewhere around 1818. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. But later on, he changed his last name to Douglass. We might get into that later. Frederick Douglass is probably one of the finest human beings ever produced by the United States, at least in my opinion, because he was so, he just clinged to the next step. Like, he would get a small understanding of something and move on and cling to it and understand something even though he may not be fully aware of it. Very interesting book. I believe that I've read it in its audio format about 3 times. And here's looking at you, Florida. This should make everyone uncomfortable when you read this book. I'm going to do a little bit of quoting from the book just to emphasize some of the larger points that I found interesting about this person we call Frederick Douglass. So, in the course of the book, My Bondage, My Freedom, it covers essentially his entire life from being a small boy, around 1819 or so, or, probably 1820, something when he's old enough to remember things, till, 1855, when he was, a speaker. And really going through his life. Yeah, it's not an easy book to read. And it's not because it's written in an older language and kind of, that adds to the difficulty. But a lot of times it's just so uncomfortable to read what sort of things were endured by this character who has a legendary status in the United States. And a character who's just isn't given enough study. Because as I quoted in the beginning, he has some amazing literature and an incredible worldview, far ahead of his time. And what an incredibly brave person he was, too. And I really encourage everyone to go and pick up My Bondage, My Freedom and read it. Because it's going to give you a perspective on early America that you just won't have unless you go and read some of these firsthand accounts. And I'm not going to lie, I don't think that the book is actually for everyone, because you probably come to points where you might want to put it down because of the brutality described within. But it's all a part of this human nature and his experience growing up in the time that he did and the circumstances that he was in. Of course, if you don't know anything about Frederick Douglass, he was born a slave, and he eventually made his way to being a free man. And what an interesting ride. And that's why I decided to do this, because I hope it makes Florida uncomfortable. Because I'm uncomfortable sitting here I'm still grappling with how do I present this in a way that's respectful and understood, and really give light to this interesting life that this great man lived. Of course, he wasn't perfect, but who is, all right? And, really, for me, the beginning of this story starts with him learning to read. So he taught himself how to read, in secrecy, almost. Now, how this got started, I'll just read you a quote from the book here. The frequent hearing of my mistress reading the Bible, for she often read aloud when her husband was absent, soon awakened my curiosity in respect to this mystery of reading, and roused in me the desire to learn. Having no fear of my kind mistress before my eyes, she had then given me no reason to fear, I frankly asked her to teach me to read, And without hesitation, the dear woman began the task. And very soon, by her assistance, I was master of the alphabet and could spell words of 3 or 4 letters. My mistress seemed almost proud of my progress, as if I had been her own child. And supposing that her husband would be as well pleased, she made no secret of what she was doing for me. Indeed, she exultingly told him of the aptness of her pupil in her intention to persevere in teaching me, and of the duty which she felt it to teach me, at least to read the Bible. Here aroused the first cloud over my Baltimore prospects, the pursuer of drenching rains and cold blasts. Master Hugh was amazed at the simplicity of his spouse, and probably, for the first time, he unfolded to her the true philosophy of slavery, and the particular rules necessary to be observed by masters and mistresses in the management of their human chattels. Mr. Auld promptly forbade the continuance of her instruction, telling her, in the first place, that the thing itself was unlawful, that it was also unsafe, and could only lead to mischief. But that's a great point for even today. Whereas trying to keep people from learning how to read, or keeping people from reading and looking into the past and learning about things, well, this is how you keep society within the due bounds that you set for it. Because as soon as you become a learned person and you can look around and see what's outside, just like what books do for us, books transport you into another world. And you can read straight off the page things written down from somebody from, 1855. I'm reading off the internet. So not only books, but just text and words. It's really important to keep people from learning how to read properly, because if you do teach them, well, I mean, they become smart and they know better. How about that? So for tyrants, making sure to keep the populace dumb is one of their main goals. And it was a goal for slavery as well, as it was unlawful to teach slaves to read during the time. Getting right into that uncomfortability, folks. But I'm not going to shy away from how uncomfortable this is. And, but like I said, I'm just struggling to do it respectfully and honestly to the best of my ability. And somehow make it entertaining. But I'm not really so worried about being entertaining, because I think this is so important for our time. Just with all the things going on in America right now, we don't even have to do the work anymore. We can just look back and see what work's already been done. So Frederick Douglass has done quite a bit for us. So this, of course, was when he was in Baltimore as a child. So we've skipped over a huge part of his life growing up. But he was sent to be sort of like a little buddy for Thomas Auld. But since he had already gotten a good handle on the alphabet, hey, no big deal, right? He gained that knowledge. And once you gain it, you don't lose that. And especially for someone like the young Frederick Douglass, he grabbed onto this idea and really he found ways to teach himself how to read. So one of the ways that he did this, once of course Miss Auld was no longer allowed to teach him, he would go with Thomas Auld and he would look after him and whatnot. But while he was out there and he was able to talk with the other children, he would often exchange things like food. He would trade his food for lessons in or, the alphabet and spelling and reading and writing, which is, if you really think about it, quite earnest. I mean, probably didn't have a whole lot of food to begin with, but he was holding on to things so that he could learn more and feed this fire for learning and reading. And I really love the way that he learned how to read, because it is such a story of someone who just tenaciously bites a hold of what he's after and doesn't let it go, and does it in secret. Another way he would do it is when his little friend would bring home workbooks and things and show them to his parents on how well he had done. He would often snatch those old books up and then write in all the margins and do all the lessons himself. And he knew that if he was caught doing this, he would be punished. But that didn't seem to bother him. And he wanted to read the Bible, so it was like, hey, it's the Bible, you shouldn't be reading, but at least it's the Bible. And he became very acquainted with the lessons in there. And he used them to his advantage on many, many occasions. Of course, because, it's the lessons in there are supposed to go across the board, so why wouldn't you use them? And it helped him to learn how to read. I think sometimes it's difficult for modern people to wrap our minds around what it was like in those days. But now we have the internet, at least for a while, that, things can happen in real time across the world. So, you can get books at your disposal right on your device at any time. We just have all these things available to us. And most of the time, it just wasn't like that for people in these times in the 1800s. You just had what was available to you in your particular sphere. So this is kind of one of those interesting things that I found in the book. And he's kind of talking about when he started to hear slaveholders talk about abolitionists and how that it was the work of the abolitionists who caused these slaves to do things, bad things, burn down their master's house or whatever. But he this was interesting to me because it was like he didn't even know what abolitionist movement was or who was this abolitionist. So I've got an excerpt from the book here. The dictionary afforded me very little help. It taught me that abolition was the act of abolishing. But it left me in ignorance at the very point where I most wanted information, and that was as to the thing to be abolished. A city newspaper, the Baltimore American, gave me the incendiary information denied me by the dictionary. In its columns I found that on a certain day, a vast number of petitions and memorials had been presented to Congress, praying for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia and the abolition of the slave trade between states of the Union. This was enough. So, being kept in the dark so much that he didn't even know what the abolitionist movement was. Crazy, right? But he knew how to read, so he could pick up the Baltimore American and, figure out, this is what they're trying to do. Oh, you can just be against slavery as a whole and the trading between states? Great. Well, that sounds good. I'm totally for that. It's hard for me to understand, the lack of understanding, because, I mean, in modern times, we just come up with so much information that it's not really, some things aren't, if they aren't understood, bang, we can go and understand them. But in these times, it certainly wasn't like that. It not only took the dictionary, but it took a newspaper to put those things together. So he's kind of discovered how to read. He's learned that there are people that oppose slavery. And something strange happens. It's strange to me because of my modern brain, but because he's considered property, he goes, his technical master dies, which means that the rest of property has to be split up, which leads him back. He's no longer in St. Michael's. He goes back to someplace near Tuckahoe. I'm kind of, which I believe is in Virginia, and I could be wrong about that. But there's an interesting story about how he's sent off to get an attitude adjustment. But it really teaches him how to work hard, because he's been living in the city, and life in the city is different than people who live on the plantations and work on the plantations. He got into some trouble, and they sent him to live with a man named Covey. And I'm not going to talk much about this because this is one of those chapters that's extremely uncomfortable at all points. Like, as I'm saying that, I'm like, ooh, this is uncomfortable. But it's really quite an interesting story to read, at least in this part, because he ends up whooping this guy Covey. he ends up whooping his ass, and Covey tries to enlist other slaves to come and, hey, help me, and he's like, that's not what I'm doing, it's like, that's not what I'm here to do, so I'm not doing that. And he ends up just whooping this guy, and he never bothers him again because he fears for loss of reputation, and he's not actually legally allowed to do any more than what he's already done, because it's not his property, as it says. But how funny is that? he just whoops the ass of his overseer, and it ends up just being like a non-issue. That's fun. Go read the book. You won't be disappointed. And then eventually he's sent back to St. Michael's, I believe. And he goes back to work in the shipyards as a caulker. So what a caulker is from what I understand, you take oakum and you put it in between, which is some sort of water-resistant substance, oakum in between the laps of the ship, and that's what keeps water out. And he was very skilled at this trade. That's kind of how he got to rent his time. So he's working at this shipyard, and this is another interesting story that I'm kind of just going to glaze over as a way to kind of entice you to read the book. As he was there in the yard, there's a lot of tension between, the whites' labor and working among the blacks, freed or otherwise. And there's this one section where he's working, and they're just, they're being awful to him in every way, and there's really nothing he can do about it. But, after a while, some of these guys gang up on him, and there's 3 of them who all come after him, and he basically beats them up. He does a lot of damage, but he takes a severe beating by these 3, and they don't kill him. Luckily, Mr. Ald took him into the sheriff, or the authority at the time, and said, look at this guy. He's beat up. He's right here. these are the dudes who did it, and I'd like you to do something about this, on the basis that he's my property. Well, he said, well, no one will speak up at the shipyard, and, his testimony is of no use. We can't use it at all. So what do you want me to do about it? As for Master Hugh's part, as I have said, he was furious about it, and he gave expression to his fury in the usual forms of speech in that locality. He poured curses on the heads of the whole shipyard company, and swore that he would have satisfaction for the outrage. His indignation was really strong and healthy, but unfortunately, it resulted from the thought that his rights of property in my person had not been respected, more than from any sense of the outrage committed on me as a man. I inferred as much as this from the fact that he could himself beat and mangle when it suited him to do so, bent on having satisfaction, as he said. Just as soon as I got a little better from my bruises, Master Hugh took me to Esquire Watson's office on Bond Street, Fells Point, with a view to procuring the arrest of those who had assaulted me. He related the outrage to the magistrate, as I had related to him, that a warrant would at once be issued for the arrest of the lawless ruffians. Mr. Watson heard it all, and instead of drawing up a warrant, he inquired, "Mr. Auld, who saw this assault of which you speak?" "It was done, sir, in the presence of a shipyard full of hands." "Sir," said Watson, "I'm sorry, but I cannot move in this matter except on the oath of white witnesses." "But here's the boy. Look at his head and face," said the excited Master Hugh. "They show what has been done." But Watson insisted that he was not authorized to do anything unless white witnesses of the transaction would come forward and testify to what had taken place. He could issue no warrant on my word against white persons. If I had been killed in the presence of 1,000 blacks, their testimony combined would have been insufficient to arrest a single murderer. Master Hugh for once was compelled to say that this state of things was too bad, and he left the office of the magistrate disgusted. Talk about uncomfortable, huh? This is a piece of history that is being described here. And, it seems like one that still exists in our legal system in some way. All we want is to, everyone to be treated the same. But in this instance, just because of who it was, they weren't going to do anything. So that's how the laws were set up. Are we uncomfortable yet? Let's keep going. So that was in a Baltimore shipyard. And, this kind of led to him discovering a different way to work and still provide money to the person who he was obligated in some way to make sure and provide that funds. And it goes to that idea of hiring his time. So hiring his time, that makes sense to us, right? That's kind of how we do it. In the modern world, we all hire our time. But at this time, this was a different way of working for your master as a slave. And here from the book, I'll read again. "My discontent grew upon me, and I was on the lookout for a means of escape. With money, I could easily have managed the matter, and therefore I hit upon the plan of soliciting the privilege of hiring my time. It is quite common in Baltimore to allow slaves this privilege, and it is the practice also in New Orleans. A slave who is considered trustworthy can, by paying his master a definite sum regularly, at the end of each week, dispose of his time as he likes. It so happened that I was not in very good order and was far from being a trustworthy slave. Yeah, you knew he didn't have like a great didn't have a great shot at this. But at this time, this is not Captain Ald, but Mr. Thomas Ald, who is actually the boy he was sent to look after when he was a kid. And now he has dominion over him, even though he was still the property of the older Hugh. Strange. I know, this is very, very uncomfortable. It's not getting any more comfortable as I'm doing this, but, I told you it was going to be like this. More uncomfortability coming. Just a second. Here we go. So he went and asked if he could do this hiring of time. It said, about 2 months after applying to Master Thomas for the privilege of hiring my time, I applied to Master Hugh for the same liberty, supposing him to be unacquainted with the fact that I had made a similar application to Master Thomas and had been refused. My boldness in making this request fairly astounded him at first. He gazed at me in amazement. But I had many good reasons for pressing the matter, and after listening to them a while, he did not absolutely refuse, but he told me that he would think of it. Here, then, was a gleam of hope. So he just kind of, he's blowing these guys away just by his boldness, just like, hey, this is what I'd like to do, and they are kind of astounded by it. What a man, right? Even in the situation he's in, he's like, I can do better than this, and not only that, I could probably do better for you. But, I mean, he's got this plan. He's trying to figure out how can he get away, and this is a way to do it. So he's about being bold. I mean, why not? He might have to take some consequences, but he's going to do it anyway because he wants that chance. So this is another quote from the book here. After mature reflection, as I must suppose it was, Master Hugh granted me the privilege in question on the following terms. I was to be allowed all my time to make bargains for work, to find my own employment, and to collect my own wages. And in return for this liberty, I was required or obligated to pay him $3 at the end of each week, and to board and clothe myself and buy my own caulking tools. A failure in any of these particulars would put an end to my privilege. This was a hard bargain. The wear and tear of clothing, the losing and breaking of tools, and the expense of board made it necessary for me to earn at least $6 per week to keep even with the world. All who are acquainted with caulking know how uncertain and irregular that employment is, and it can be done to advantage only in dry weather, for it is useless to put wet oakum into a seam. Rain or shine, however, work or no work, at the end of each week, the money must be forthcoming. Master Hugh seemed to be very much pleased for a time with this arrangement, and well he might be, for it was decidedly in his favor. It relieved him of all anxiety concerning me. His money was sure. He had armed my love of liberty with a lash and driver far more efficient than any I had before known. And while he derived all the benefits of slaveholding by the arrangement without the evils, I endured all the evils of being a slave, and yet suffered all the care and anxiety of a responsible freeman. So this is the deal. This is the deal that he now has, is that he can manage his own time. But it requires him to do everything that a free man would have to do. He still has this quite literal chain that he has to deal with, as well as the responsibilities of a free man. So this is pretty interesting to me because this wasn't something that I knew about. Like, before I read this book, I didn't know that this was a thing, that could have been done. But it's very true, of all the evils that are associated with that. Seems like a good deal for him, right? Well, what happens is he goes to meet with some friends of his on Saturday night to a camp meeting about 12 miles from Baltimore. And he had his money for the week already. He just, stayed for a couple of days. And then he goes back and he gives him his money. And then he gets this, awful tongue lashing. He's just like, hey, you know better than this. What are you doing? You're not supposed to do this. Oh, you didn't know that you weren't supposed to do this? Yeah, right. Then it kind of just ended his partial freedom. It's I'll go back to the book here. Thus ended my partial freedom. I could hire my time no longer, and I obeyed my master's orders at once. The little taste of liberty which I had, although, as the reader will have seen, it was far from being unallowed, by no means enhanced my contentment with slavery. And this is the good part. I love this part. He says, punished thus by Master Hugh, it was now my turn to punish him. Since, I thought, you will make a slave of me, I will await your orders on all things. And instead of going to look for work Monday morning, as I had formerly done, I remained at home during the entire week, without the performance of a single stroke of work. Saturday night came, and he called upon me, as usual, for my wages. I, of course, told him I had done no work, and had no wages. Here we were at the point of coming to blows. His wrath had been accumulating during the whole week, for he evidently saw that I was making no efforts to get work, but was most aggravatedly awaiting his orders in all things. So this went on as his little way to strike back. But it didn't last long, because he was threatened that, hey, if you don't find work, I'm going to find some work for you. And that kind of was terrifying, because there could be all number of things that could be. So he decided to just go back to work, and he easily found employment again. And he was bringing more money than he normally brought back to him. So, that was the change there. And he ended up kind of just doing that for a while. So we'll go back to the book on this one. So, of course, I easily obtained work. And at the end of the week, which, by the way, was exceedingly fine, I brought Master Hugh nearly $9. The effect of this mark of returning good sense on my part was excellent. He was very much pleased. He took the money, committed me, and told me I might have done the same thing the week before. It is a blessed thing that the tyrant may not always know the thoughts and purposes of his victim. Master Hugh little knew what my plans were. The going to camp meeting without asking his permission, the insolent answers made to his reproaches, the sulky deployment of the week after being deprived of the privilege of hiring my time, had awakened in him the suspicion that I might be cherishing disloyal purposes. My object, therefore, in working steadily, was to remove suspicion, and in this I succeeded admirably. He probably thought I was never better satisfied with my condition than at the very time I was planning my escape. The second week passed, and again I carried him my full week's wages, $9, and so well pleased was he that he gave me 25 cents, and bade me to make good use of it. I told him I would, for one of the uses which I meant to put it was to pay my fare on the Underground Railroad. How smart is this guy? Just outwitting him at every turn, just making it happen, That's why I'm such a fan of Frederick Douglass. This book in particular points out so many ways that he was cunning and smart and tough. Just an excellent person in general, something that we could all look up to in the face of tyranny. So this comes from a little bit earlier in the book, but it kind of gives you a look into the philosophy that he was delving into, and that, he was really using sound logic in defeating these evils that he was entrapped in. So back to the book here, I'll read a little more. The practice from week to week of openly robbing me of all my earnings kept the nature and character of slavery constantly before me. I could be robbed by indirection, but this was open and barefaced to be endured. I could see no reason why I should, at the end of each week, pour the reward of my honest toil into the purse of any man. The thought itself vexed me, and the manner in which Master Hugh received my wages vexed me more than the original wrong. Carefully counting out the money and rolling it out, dollar by dollar, he would look at me in the face, as if he would search my heart as well as my pocket, and reproachfully ask me, "Is that all?" implying that I had perhaps kept back part of my wages, or, if not so, the demand was made possibly to make me feel that after all I was an unprofitable servant, draining me of the last cent of my hard earnings. He would, however, occasionally, when I brought home an extra large sum, dole out to me a sixpence or a shilling, with a view, perhaps, of kindling my gratitude. But this practice had the opposite effect. It was an admission of my right to the whole sum. The fact that he had given me any part of my wages was proof that he suspected that I had a right to the whole sum of them. I always felt uncomfortable having received anything in this way, for I feared that the giving me a few cents might possibly ease his conscience and make him feel himself a pretty honorable robber after all. So he's just, he's saying, this guy is robbing me. I'm working, he's taking it from me. Why? This makes no sense. And it's a strong passage. I'm constantly amazed by how well this is written, and it is sort of in this older English style. So, that's just a really sums up kind of the way that he felt about it and how logic prevails, even in the face of evil. Well, at this point in the book, he makes his escape. And one thing that I thought particularly striking about the book when he starts talking about the means of his escape, he just refused to say how he escaped. The logic that he gives is that every time a slave would escape and they would find out how it was done, that was it for everybody else who wanted to try that method. And he wanted to protect the people who helped him along the way, because they would be in danger as well if people knew that they were helping runaway slaves, right? So he makes it to New York and, has some trouble finding work. And, obviously, even though he's in a free state, there's still all this stress of slave catchers who could come up to these northern states and take them back. So he did the best he could, and he eventually, finds friends that will help him, and describes some of the hardships that he has, just trying to survive in his first years as a free man. And yeah, it's difficult. It just becomes, it's still more uncomfortable reading, but I think that it's important for us to know these things, like how a man actually did escape from slavery and made his way, and then his character just continues to get more and more interesting, because when he hooks up with abolitionists, this is when his life really starts to take shape of what I believe what he felt he was supposed to do. And he was also very, very good at it, because he was introduced to speak at one of these meetings. And the thing that I find intriguing about this is that it seems, when reading this, that people didn't believe or didn't know that these horrible evils were being committed in southern states by slave owners. It was like they didn't know that it was happening. They didn't understand it because they live in a northern state. They didn't have the internet back then. There was no books being written about it. So a lot of times he spoke so well that people didn't believe he was a slave at all. And they didn't believe the horrible things that he was talking about. They didn't believe that they were happening, of which are described in the book. They just didn't. They didn't know. And I found that to be incredible. How in the world, how could you not know? Like, you know that it exists. You know that slavery exists, but you don't know to what extent it's being carried out as a northern person? Huh. I thought that was an interesting and very important thing to learn from this book. Was that, ignorance was and always will be the tool of the tyrant. You got to keep people stupid. You can't let them read. You can't let them know stuff. Yeah, I'll quote from the book here a little bit. They said, "I did not talk like a slave, look like a slave, nor act like a slave." And they believed that I had never been south of the Mason-Dixon line. He don't tell us where he came from, what his master's name was, how he got away, nor the story of his experience. Besides, he's educated, and is in this a contradiction of all the facts we have concerning ignorance of slaves. Thus, I was pretty fair way to be denounced as an impostor. The Committee of Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society knew all the facts of my case and agreed with me in prudence of keeping them private. They therefore never doubted my being a genuine fugitive, but going down the aisles of the churches in which I spoke, and hearing free-spoken Yankees saying repeatedly, "He's never been a slave, I'll warrant ye that, I'll warrant ye," I resolved to dispel all doubt at no distant day, but such a revelation of facts as could not be made by any other than a genuine fugitive. So, just because, they just didn't even believe it. They're like, no, this can't be. We don't want to believe it. There's no way. Because he was, this is a very intelligent person we're dealing with here. Probably much more intelligent than most of the educated Yankees that he's talking to. Right? They just didn't even believe it. Because he had to keep all that stuff secret. He couldn't just tell who his master was. He couldn't tell people some of his experiences. He couldn't tell anybody who helped him. He couldn't tell where he worked. Because the slave catchers would find him and take him back. Take him back. I keep saying this over and over again. The bravery and boldness and intelligence and wisdom of this man, unprecedented. And he really was unprecedented because, as far as I know, he was like the first to start to be a speaker as an escaped slave for the abolitionist movement. And I'll quote again the next line. In a little less than 4 years, therefore, after becoming a public lecturer, I was introduced to write out the leading facts connected with my experience in slavery, giving names of persons and places and dates, thus putting it in the power of any who doubted to ascertain the truth or falsehood of my story of being a fugitive slave. This statement soon became known in Maryland, and I had reason to believe that an effort would be made to recapture me. Now, because he made this statement saying, look, this is what happened. He was like, they are going to come and get me. And it's like, you really have to wonder, did people just not believe him because they didn't want to? Or were there people who were actively disagreeing because they wanted the reward for capturing him and being able to take him back? Creepy. Disgusting. That there are characters in this, that humans that would be willing to go out and do that, to drag people back into slavery, right? I mean, well, there's people like that out there today, and it's disgusting. But I digress. Because after this, he's been a lecturer for 4 years. Now he's really thinking that he's probably he's gonna be captured and go back. So the next chapter in his life begins. because of this threat of being returned to slavery, him and some of his friends in the abolitionist movement decided that they would, hey, well, let's just send you over to England and you can lecture over there. But they had a problem, of course. This is from the book. On applying for passage to England, on board the Cambrai on the Cunard line, my friend James Ian Buffum of Lynn, Massachusetts, was informed that I could not be received on board as the cabin passenger. American prejudice against color triumphed over British liberty and civilization, and erected a color test and condition for crossing the sea in the cabin of a British vessel. So even the British vessel had Americans on board, and they're like, no, we can't have that. But they ended up getting him like a steerage, a second-class cabin or something. He couldn't go up to the rest of the ship. But they got him, on the ship, and he was on his way. And he says here, in 2 days after leaving Boston, one part of the ship was about to be as free to me as the other. My fellow passengers not only visited me, but invited me to visit them on the saloon deck. My visits here, however, were but seldom. I preferred to live with my privileges and keep my own premises. I found this quite as much in accordance with good policy as with my own feelings. So he had a little more liberty, but he was like, I think I'm just going to stay to my own ship, my own room in the ship for now. And there was an incident where he was in the saloon, and there's a problem there. In 2 days, he was there in Liverpool. So he's over safely in the UK, and his friends actually purchased for him his freedom. Here, and I'll read the excerpt here. My time and labors while abroad were divided between England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Upon this experience alone, I might write a book twice the size of this, My Bondage, My Freedom. I've visited and lectured in nearly all the large towns and cities in the United Kingdom, and enjoyed many favorable opportunities for observation and information. But books on England are abundant, and the public may therefore dismiss any fear that I am meddling another infliction in that line. Though, in truth, I should like much to write a book on those countries, if for nothing else, to make grateful mention of the many dear friends whose benevolent actions toward me are ineffably stamped upon my memory and warmly treasured in my heart. To these friends I owe my freedom in the United States. On their own motion, without any solicitation from me, Mrs. Henry Richardson, a clever lady, remarkable for her devotion to every good work, taking the lead, they raised a fund sufficient to purchase my freedom, and actually paid it over, and placed the papers. And then it actually shows the language of the paper. So what an interesting way to gain one's freedom. Escape, become a lecturer, decide that the only way to continue to be free is to go to England and lecture, and then while you're there, your friends actually do the deed of procuring your freedom. Extraordinary. And he was quite a successful lecturer in the United Kingdom. This is like 1847, but there's a whole lot in here about how the church, one of the churches he was lecturing in, accepted some money from slaveholders in the Americas, and there was a big uproar about send back the money because the public in England didn't want to be a part of that. They didn't want any part of that. There's so much in this book that I'm just kind of glossing over. So, he wrote one more book after this. But this is kind of towards the end here, and I have there's a little short description kind of from the book here. I have now given the reader an imperfect sketch of 9 years' experience in freedom. 3 years as a common laborer on the wharfs of New Bedford, 4 years as a lecturer in England, and 2 years of semi-exile in Great Britain and Ireland. A single ray of light remains to be flung upon my life during the last 8 years, and my story will be done. Summing up what he's done, and what he spent his life doing and how it came to be. And it's really just about, the years that he spent in bondage and the years that he spent free. And he continued throughout his life to fight for the abolition of slavery. And, there's a lot of very interesting things that could be talked about with Frederick Douglass. I will finish this podcast off with one more quote from the very last lines of his book. I shall labor in the future, as I have labored in the past, to promote the moral, social, religions, and intellectual elevation of the free colored people, never forgetting my own humble origins, nor refusing, while heaven lends me ability, to use my voice, my pen, or my vote to advocate great and primary work of the universal and unconditional emancipation of my entire race. Well, and I think that, I wish that more people would find themselves devoted to any cause as he was for his cause. And, it's just like Martin Luther King said, that an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. And it was just as important, it was the same then as it is now. If this one person can come from the lowest of society's low and raise himself to the point of being a very prominent speaker in the United States, and he was right up till the very end. This is why I said in the beginning that I think that Frederick Douglass is one of the greatest humans ever produced by the United States. This was just another extraordinary person that has left a mark on me, because I really have read this book, and it is at times almost unbearable to listen to the things that this guy went through, but he always kept an air of dignity about him. And as I've gone through this, I've kind of left out a whole bunch of very important and noteworthy things that Frederick Douglass did. His associations with Abraham Lincoln have been written about to some extent. No, I forgot to mention that he changed his name from Frederick Bailey to Douglass so that he could, more efficiently escape being taken back as a slave before he went to England. He also had a ton of photographs taken of him. During the time, this was like a new, expensive thing. Not a whole lot of people were doing that. But he had over 160. He sat for over 160 portraits. And in every one, he kind of has the same look and disposition. And a lot of people say that was because the caricatures of the time were very, racist and unflattering. And he wanted people to see what the real Frederick Douglass looked like, and he wanted people to see someone dignified, and he wanted people to see what a real person he was instead of these caricatures that were normally seen in the public. He founded and edited his first anti-slavery newspaper, the North Star, December 3rd, 1847. One of the interesting things about that newspaper is that most of his friends were telling him it wasn't a good idea, but he ended up running it for quite some time. There's so much that I'm leaving out, and there's so much more in these books that I want people to go and check out. And I think what fascinates me about Frederick Douglass is the fact that, he wanted our nation to live up to its qualities. This was someone who truly fought for freedom for everybody. I will forever look up to the great Frederick Douglass for really trying to move people towards what America should be about: freedom and equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everybody. Not people who have enough money. Not just people who are a certain race. Not just people who were born here. No, everybody. Everybody should have an equal shot here in America. This has been another edition of History and Whatevea with James Manning III. And I would really encourage you all to please help me out if you like any of these at all, to like and subscribe and tell your friends. And hey, right now, you can send me an email, jm3e.pod@gmail.com. So, would love to hear from you, and thank you so much. All right, we'll catch you next time on History and Whatevea.